Are you building an n8n automation workflow and you are stuck while integrating an app that is not officially supported by n8n? Or you want to automate data transfer between different services in real time? That's where APIs and webhooks come into play, because these are the tools that you will leverage while connecting apps or services that are not officially supported by n8n. Hello and welcome to my course on AI automation powered by n8n. In the last lesson of this course, we talked about code node, which is also an essential part when you have to take your automation workflow to a more customized, have more control on them. In this lesson today, I'm going to explain the topic of HTTP node, because webhooks we have already covered in section 2 of this course, so you can go and check out over there. And by the end of this lesson, you will know how to work with APIs and integrate n8n with services that officially does not support it. So what is an API? First of all, API stands for Application Programming Interface. You can think of it more like a translator between different apps, as it allows different applications to send and receive data among each other without involving any kind of human. These APIs uses requests and responses. Requests are more like I want to request some data or I want to post some data. Responses are more like either they are returning the data back for the request of asking for data, or they are returning the confirmation that data has been posted successfully or received successfully. Some of the common API examples include weather API, where you ask or request for weather information about a particular location, and the API responds back with the temperature data or weather forecast for that particular location in the response of that request. Second example could be Google Maps API. You send the coordinates and get back the directions from it. Third example could be CRM API. CRM is customer relationship management application, where you store all the information about your customers. So in such a case, you might be sending customer details to be stored in your CRM software, and the CRM application is responding back with a confirmation that user details were successfully saved. So with the help of APIs, you can have different applications talk to each other, fetch information, or trigger actions all automatically. I have already published a dedicated detailed lesson on webhook in the section 2 of this course. However, since both the topics are related to each other, let's quickly refresh the basics of webhook. So what is a webhook? A webhook is an alert that sends data as soon as an event happens. It's real time, meaning application gets the update instantly instead of checking manually for any kind of update. Unlike APIs, which require you to ask for data, webhook sends the data as soon as an event has occurred. Some of the common example could be a Shopify application sending you an alert as soon as an order is placed, a Stripe application executing a webhook as soon as a payment is made, a Slack application sending you a webhook as soon as a message is received. So you can consider APIs like making a phone call and getting the information for yourself. Rather, webhooks are more like text alerts that come to you automatically when something is about to be shared with you. But in today's lesson, we are going to focus on APIs, and APIs in n8n are implemented with the help of HTTP node. So what is this HTTP node or HTTP request node? HTTP request node lets you make HTTP requests, fetch data from any application, post data to any application, and interact with external services with a REST API. It's a built-in API client, much like a Postman in n8n, and it is very useful when there is no direct integration or inbuilt node available in n8n for the services or application you are trying to build that workflow or integration with. In order to use this HTTP request node, you might need to be familiar with some of the basic API terminology or REST API terminology. However, if you follow along me in this lesson, most of the concepts are self-explanatory and you should get the understanding of these basic terms. So now let's get to the screen share and understand this HTTP request node in detail. Alright, I am logged into the cloud instance of my n8n workspace, and I have created a new workflow called workflow 11 HTTP node, and this is a blank canvas. So first we'll add a trigger. Let's add a manual trigger over here. Let's click on this and search for HTTP request node. This is the node that we'll be using. It makes an HTTP request and returns the response data. And you can see webhook is also there. starts the workflow when using a webhook is called. Well, we have covered this topic in detail in section 2, so I'm not going to repeat that. I'm going to click on HTTP request node, and now you can see the configuration screen of HTTP request node has opened, and there are two ways to configure this HTTP node. First one you can see is the parameterized base, where we configure these parameters that you see: method, URL, authentication. We are going to come back to them one by one in a moment. However, this is first way of configuring it, and then you can see this import curl. We are going to talk about this as well, that what this command does, so stay tuned. But in short, this lets you automatically configure the HTTP node if you have a curl request. But what is a curl request and how do you get it? Stay tuned till the end of this lesson, because I'm going to cover that. But first we are going to focus on parameter configuration. So the first parameter that you see over here is method. So while making these HTTP requests, you need to specify what kind of method it is, and you can see that it's mainly delete. If you want to delete a record, we should use method like delete. But if you want to fetch the information, the get is the most common method that is used. And similarly, there is another one which is more like post. It is required to post the new data which is there, and sometimes people use put in order to update a particular record. So most common methods that you will be using while making HTTP request calls are either get or post, and sometimes put, and maybe infrequently you might use delete as well. But in most cases you will be making a soft delete, which is more like flagging a record as is deleted equal to true or false. But in those cases, ideally you should be making put request, because you are updating a record, not essentially permanently deleting a record. So I'll leave this to get. Then you have the URL where you will be making the request. Then you have to specify the authentication, because understand, it could be a no authentication, like you are making a call to a public API which has exposed the services to everyone. But not everyone or every application or every service is going to expose whatever data they have publicly to anyone. So they would be authenticating who is requesting that data, whether they have subscribed to their services, whether they own that data, whether they own that application. So the source application against which you are requesting data must authenticate your HTTP request that you are a valid user requesting the data, or you are allowed to update the records into data. So that's where this authentication comes handy, and you can see there is predefined credential type and generic credential type, and I'm going to talk in detail about them in a while. Then comes query parameters. Most of the APIs allows you to send the request data, like for example, against what user you want information. So user key or username over here becomes like a query parameter that you would send to the external service and make a request against it. I'm going to show you with the help of an example in a while, but that's more like a query parameter. If I turn it on, you can specify what query parameters you want to send in the name and value field. We'll just take an example of it. Then this is headers. Again, similarly, name, value, key pairs you can send for headers. And HTTP request has HTTP request headers, and HTTP response, the response that we get while making that call, has response headers associated to it. But since we are making a request call, we have to send the expected HTTP headers, whatever the service requires. And finally, this is the body, which may be expected, may not be expected. You might be okay just sending the query parameters, but in case application or the source system does not support the query parameters mechanism, then it must be asking you the information of request in the body of it. It might be confusing, so let's go ahead and take an example of a weather API app and go through all these parameters in detail. So I've created an AccuWeather development account. So over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the forecast API. So if I click on it, you would see that the information is available for getting daily forecast, and you can see the method as the documentation of your external app, because here we are calling AccuWeather to fetch the weather information. So that becomes my source data application or service which we want to integrate into n8n workflow, and I want to fetch the weather data. So while fetching the weather data, you can see all the methods are there, and most of them you are seeing as get, because this application does not allow you to post data or update their records, because they are basically providing us data. That's why the method you see is get over here. So we want to use this 1 day of daily forecast. I'm going to click on it. So as soon as I open up the details of this API, API, you can see some familiar terms that I was using. So method is get over here. There is a resource URL. So against this URL is what we are going to make the request. This is the API URL against which we can get 1 day of daily forecast data. If for example you need something else, maybe like 10-day daily forecast data, then the URL will be different. You can see 10-day over here, and if I come back over here and see this will be like 1 day. So the URL is different and URL is unique for each and every API we want to call. So over here you can see this is like more like a key, and this key is unique ID used to search for a specific location. So we can click on to edit it. This key I have already used for New York location. So we are going to fetch the weather forecast for New York. So this is URL, and now you can see the query parameters are also there. So we have to configure these parameters, especially the API key, because language details and metric are optional and they have some default value of ENUS false and false. If we have to override it, we have to specify these query parameters in our request, otherwise not. Then over here you can get the details of request and response as well. So URL, I'm going to copy this as is. So let's go back. So method is get, we have already seen that. In the URL I'm going to paste this, and we wanted to have a key as well. So the key was basically this. So let's use this. Let me expand it. It seems that the key is not copied, so let's copy the key as well. So this key is for New York location. So I'm just going to paste it over here. Now let's go back. So for the authentication, nothing is specified over here, but you can see there is something called API key. So in this case, it is expecting the authentication to happen via API key, and that needs to be passed in the query parameters. So it is not asking us to create some sort of secure credential, and what those secure credentials are. If I open up the HTTP request node documentation and just scroll up a bit over here, you would see that method already we have seen, URL we have already seen, and now there is a section of authentication, and in which predefined credentials are there, and then there are generic credentials. So if I open up what is a predefined credential, so first thing is that because this AccuWeather API is not expecting us a full-blown credential to be in place or authentication mechanism in place, so we are going to click on none for this particular example. However, if I want to show you the predefined credential, this already say we have already implemented authentication for many services so that you don't have to set it up manually. So if I click on it, you would see a lot of services which are already allowing us. So basically for calling Airtable OAuth 2 API, Airtable API, Airtop API. So for all these services, n8n has already built the authentication mechanism. It is more like adding the credentials in your credentials inbox. You might have seen while using the Slack node, we created the credentials. So it is more like that only. However, we are not using a dedicated Slack node or some other node that we were trying to use. We are using HTTP node to make a Slack API call, which is not supported by Slack node. So in that case, we will be using this predefined credential type for Slack app. Now, if we look at the custom one, so generic custom types, you would see that there are basic authentication, which is more like if I click on this and create new credential, you would see username and password. That's the most basic authentication that is there. Then you have a bearer token as well. So in this case, it is going to ask me a token. If I click on new credential, you can see bearer token is there. So this is again an authentication mechanism for validating, authenticating, and as well as authorizing various API calls. So in all this basic authentication, bearer auth and OAuth 2 is the most common form of generic authentication that most of the applications provide. So if your application or service that you want to integrate with is not that popular, not that public in nature, for which n8n has already provided a way to create credentials from, the built-in types, then you have to use this generic credential type. And whatever type of authentication in between basic auth, bearer auth, or OAuth 2, you can use that to create your own credential. But for this example, no specific authentication method is there. So I'm going to use none, and I'm going to turn on this send query parameters and using these field below. So if I go back over here and see this is the required one. As you can see, required is also mentioned. So I'm going to use this API key, and I'm going to paste it as name. I already have the API key generated for my API usage, so I'm going to use that over here, paste it. and now we are going to have headers. So if we go back over here, there are no headers expected over here. However, there could be a possibility that some APIs request headers as well. So you can see none header is there. So in the body as well, again, nothing is expected from the body too. You can see that the documentation does not have anything in the body as well. But if I turn it on, although it is not expected in this particular API, but you can see the body content type could be JSON. So you can send this request data in the form of a JSON, or you can have a form URL encoded or form data or a n8n binary file. The binary you are getting as an input into this node, you can basically post it while uploading a file to Google Drive. The Google Drive node itself provides that. However, if you want to call custom API of Google Drive to upload a file, then you will be using the body content type as n8n binary file and provide the binary data which is coming as an input to it. Again, in this case, it is not applicable, so we are going to just skip it, and I'm going to turn this off. And let's just make our first HTTP request. Executing. So you can see it has been executed successfully. The response has arrived. Daily forecasts have come for the New York City. Over here you can see New York NY highlighted. You can see minimum temperature is 66, unit is Fahrenheit, maximum is going to be 73, and unit is Fahrenheit. It shows mostly cloudy, showers which are light showers in nature. So you can see that you made a request asking for information about a code or a key for a location called New York, and then you got a response back from the AccuWeather API which you can use further in your application. So that's like a request response nature of any API call. Now let's go back and maybe like delete this and again add an HTTP request node. So we just saw how you can configure HTTP request node using the parameters. Now let's look at second method of configuring HTTP node, which is via importing a curl request. Many APIs provide you these curl requests in order to test the APIs, and what you can do is import or copy paste that curl request and automatically your HTTP node would get configured. Now let's look at our example, and you can see that at the bottom, most of these API documentation would have some sort of curl request documentation on curl request so that you can test it out very quickly. So in this case, if I just paste the API key and make a send request. So now if we go back, so we have got the request, we have the response as well. If I look at the curl, this is the curl request that we have. If I copy paste this, so this is more like a simple curl request, but it could get very complicated with many query parameters, many headers into it. So if you have like a complex curl request, you can just copy paste that and come back to your HTTP node over here, click on this import curl request and just paste it. And if I click on import over here, so you can see that now my HTTP node is automatically configured. I didn't have to do any manual configuration of it. Everything was turned, like for example, send query parameters was turned on, API key was mentioned. If I execute it, it is going to execute successfully. So you can see that the request that we made using the manual configuration also fetched us this kind of data, and this curl request import while configuring this HTTP node fetched us the same sort of information. You can see that it is for New York City, minimum is 66 Fahrenheit and maximum is 73 Fahrenheit. So these were the two ways I wanted to explain in detail for configuring HTTP request nodes. But before ending this lesson, let me show you some more examples of HTTP requests so that you have better understanding of it. So this is a template that I downloaded from the official n8n template library. So over here, this is more like an HTTP request node. This workflow shows the most common use cases of HTTP request node and how to handle its output. So basically, if you look at, there are three scenarios. So first one is split into items, second one is data scraping, and third one is handling the pagination. So if I look at it, you can see that this is an HTTP request node, this is also an HTTP request node, and this is where also there is an HTTP request node. So if we open this one and click on execute, so you can see that it is basically making a call to this particular URL, getting some albums out of it. There is no query parameter, no headers, no body, but in the response they want response headers to be included. So this is very basic, nothing is there. You are just sending an HTTP request to an URL and fetching the data back from it. Now let's go back and see another example. If we look at this one, again, this is basically making similar request, nothing is there. If I execute it, it is going to make on the Wikipedia, a random page is going to be returned. It is asking the options to follow redirects. Sometimes there are some redirects, so it is allowing the maximum redirects to be 20. In the response format, you can see it is asking for file and the output name should be data. So this particular request is returning us the file data. Now if I go back and see the third one, over here, if we look at it, you can see now we are also sending some query parameters in it, and you can see these query parameters can be dynamically configured as well. So per page we want this much, page size we want this much. So these query parameters are sent to this particular request, and even the URL is being dynamically formed over here. There is no authentication, but query parameters are sent. At the bottom, response headers and status are included in order to basically detect the whether the request was failed, and the response format was auto detected. So these were some more examples of making HTTP requests. I'm sure now you must be able to connect those applications that you were waiting to connect because they were not supported by n8n officially. Now you know both the ways of making HTTP API calls or using webhooks in order to integrate different applications in your automation workflow. In the next lesson of this course, I'm going to talk about how you can pin your data, whatever data is being received, how can you pin it in your workflow, how you can edit the data, or how you can create mock data. These are going to be very essential when you are creating some complex workflows, so that you don't have to wait for the request to come in or data to be fetched from external services again and again.